Judge mocks Clint Eastwood in court, only to be stunned by his legal brilliance. Before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. The Monterey County courtroom was packed, filled with an air of anticipation. This wasn't just any legal battle. It was Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood legend, standing at the plaintiff's table. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, some spectators nudging their neighbors, while others discreetly lifted their phones to capture the moment. Outside, news vans lined the streets, satellite dishes tilted skyward, poised to broadcast every unfolding detail. For over 6 decades, Clint Eastwood had faced villains on-screen, outlaws, corrupt sheriffs, and ruthless criminals. But today his adversary wasn't a gunslinger or a crooked lawman, it was the legal system itself. The lawsuit he had filed was a straightforward property dispute. Real estate developer Gerald Madsen had encroached on Clint's land in Carmel by the Sea, constructing part of a luxury condominium beyond its rightful boundaries. Eastwood had tried to resolve the issue civilly, letters, calls, formal complaints, but all his warnings had been ignored. Now, standing in court, he was prepared to argue his own case. As Judge Wallace Bridger entered the room, a quiet fell over the courtroom. A heavy-set man in his 60s, Judge Bridger had spent decades presiding over cases of all kinds, but this was a first. Adjusting his glasses, he eyed the famed actor-turned-plaintiff with a smirk. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, tapping his gavel once, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter?" Standing tall despite his 94 years, Clint nodded, his piercing blue eyes locked onto the judge. "That's right." A chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others exchanged knowing grins, expecting to witness a complete disaster. Even Madsen, seated beside his high-powered attorney, allowed himself a small laugh. Judge Bridger leaned forward. "You do understand that legal proceedings aren't the same as Hollywood scripts, don't you? There are rules, procedures. It's not as simple as delivering a monologue and riding off into the sunset." Laughter spread through the courtroom, and reporters eagerly scribbled notes. One journalist even whispered, "This is going to be gold." But Clint didn't react. He simply waited, allowing the laughter to die down before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "I know the rules, Your Honor, and I know the law." Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And where exactly did you study law, Mr. Eastwood?" The chuckles turned into outright laughter, but Clint remained unfazed. He reached into his case file, pulled out a neatly bound stack of documents, and placed them on the table. Tapping the top page lightly, he said, "I spent the last 6 months reviewing every property law that applies to this case. I've read the local zoning codes, I've studied precedent, and I have enough evidence to prove that my land has been unlawfully encroached upon." His voice was steady, unwavering. "Now, I'm here to present that evidence. If this court is about justice, then let's get to it." The laughter vanished. For the first time, the courtroom realized something. Clint Eastwood wasn't here for theatrics. He wasn't here to entertain them. He was here to win. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the weight of his earlier mockery. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood, let's proceed." Clint sat down, his face unreadable. But as the murmurs of the crowd faded and the trial officially began, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary case, and Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man. Judge Bridger studied Eastwood for a moment, still mildly amused. He had expected the actor to flounder, tripping over legal jargon and struggling to keep up. But there was something in Eastwood's demeanor, calm, composed, unshaken, that made the judge pause. "Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed with your opening statement," Judge Bridger said, leaning back in his chair, fully expecting an awkward half-baked speech. Clint stood slowly, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't rush. He let the silence hang, a technique he had mastered in countless films. The weight of his presence alone commanded the room. Finally he spoke. "In 1992, I purchased a stretch of land in Carmel by the Sea," he began, his eyes locked on the judge. "The property lines were clearly documented. Over the years, I've maintained that land, paid taxes on it, and ensured it met all regulations. But last year, Mr. Madsen and his company decided my property wasn't mine anymore. He pulled a set of documents from his file, setting them on the table with precise, deliberate movements. Madison's company built on my land without my consent. They ignored boundaries, ignored permits, ignored me. I sent formal warnings, legal notices, requests to cease construction. They ignored those too. The room was silent, the smirks, the laughter, gone. The reporters stopped scribbling. Even Madsen's own legal team was paying close attention now. Clint pulled out aerial photographs taken over time. These images show the land before and after construction began. This, he pointed to a marked boundary on the images, is my property line. And this, he slid forward another photograph revealing the encroachment, is Madsen's development. Madison's attorney, Gerald Parker, finally spoke, clearing his throat as he stood. A tall, lean man in an expensive suit, he exuded confidence, the kind of corporate lawyer used to steamrolling cases. Your Honor, if I may. Without looking at him, Clint raised a hand. I'm not done. The courtroom froze. Even Parker hesitated. Judge Bridger nodded for Clint to continue. Clint reached into his stack and pulled out email records, letters between his legal team and Madsen's company. This is a record of every attempt I made to resolve this issue before bringing it to court. He looked directly at Madsen. They had every opportunity to do the right thing. They chose not to. Parker chuckled, shaking his head. Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, you're not a lawyer. These legal matters are complex. You've presented some evidence, sure, but do you even understand the nuances of property law? Clint leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Parker. I understand the law just fine, and I understand when someone's breaking it. The judge exhaled and rubbed his temples. He had expected a show. Instead, he was witnessing something else entirely. A man who had spent his life playing the role of justice, now demanding it for real. Very well, Judge Bridger said finally. Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed. As Clint took his seat, he could sense it, the shift in the room. They weren't laughing anymore. He wasn't reciting scripted lines or putting on a performance. Clint Eastwood was a man who had spent decades mastering the art of justice, both in film and in life, and now he was delivering his case with the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. Judge Wallace Bridger leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His tone, now measured and more respectful, reflected a shift in the courtroom. All right, Mr. Eastwood, he said, you've presented your argument. Mr. Parker, would you like to respond? Gerald Parker, the polished corporate attorney representing Gerald Madsen, smirked as he rose from his seat. If he was rattled, he wasn't showing it, at least not yet. Your Honor, while I admire Mr. Eastwood's confidence, this case is far more complex than he suggests, Parker began smoothly. He turned toward the jury and spectators, exuding the confidence of a man accustomed to winning. What we have here is a simple misunderstanding regarding property lines. I understand that Mr. Eastwood believes his land was encroached upon, but we have extensive documentation proving otherwise. With a dramatic gesture, Parker motioned to a stack of expensive leather-bound legal documents. Mr. Eastwood has done an admirable job assembling his argument, but I must remind the court that practicing law isn't as simple as reading a few legal books. The law is about interpretation, precedent, and above all, expertise. He turned toward Clint, offering a condescending smile. Now, Mr. Eastwood, I understand you've portrayed lawmen and detectives throughout your career. I must admit, I've enjoyed some of your films. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom as Parker continued. But this isn't Dirty Harry, and it's certainly not Unforgiven. He let out a small, self-assured laugh. This is real life, and in real life, you can't just shoot your way out of a legal dispute. The courtroom laughed again, though this time it felt forced, more of an attempt to follow Parker's lead than genuine amusement. Clint, still seated, didn't blink. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted the papers in front of him, as methodical as ever. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate. You're right, Clint said calmly. This isn't a movie. He stood slowly, placing both hands firmly on the table. And I'm not here to entertain you, Mr. Parker. The laughter stopped. Clint picked up a stack of legal documents and flipped through them. You want to talk about expertise? Let's talk about facts. He pulled out a large aerial photograph of his property, taken before construction began. This was my land in 2021. He pointed to the clear, legally recorded property lines. Then he lifted another photograph. And this was my land in 2023. See this? He pointed to the area where Madsen's construction had crossed the boundary line. That's your client's building on my property. Parker shifted slightly in his seat, but Clint wasn't done. He held up a printed email. This is the cease and desist notice I sent to Madsen's company when construction first started encroaching on my land. No response. He flipped to another page. This is the second notice. No response. He turned to a third. This is the third. Do you see a pattern here? The lawyer cleared his throat, searching for a way to regain control. Mr. Eastwood, property disputes are rarely this black and white. The law... Clint raised a hand, cutting him off. You ignored the law until you got caught. The room fell still. Even Judge Bridger seemed momentarily taken aback. He had seen countless self-presented litigants, but none had carried themselves with Clint Eastwood's unwavering confidence. He wasn't floundering. He wasn't unsure. He was precise, methodical, and above all, right. Parker forced a laugh, trying to regain control. Your Honor, I think we're getting carried away. This is still just an opening argument, and while Mr. Eastwood certainly knows how to command a room, we're dealing with legal technicalities here. Judge Bridger, who had initially seen this case as a novelty, was no longer so sure. He folded his hands, glancing between Parker and Eastwood. For the first time, he felt a twinge of regret for underestimating the man before him. Very well, the judge said. Mr. Parker, you will have the opportunity to present your defense soon enough. But for now, I'd like to continue hearing from Mr. Eastwood. Clint gave a small nod and took his seat, his face unreadable. But as Parker sat back down, shifting uncomfortably, one thing had become painfully clear. The judge had made a mistake by underestimating Clint Eastwood. And he wasn't the only one. By the time court adjourned, the story had already spread like wildfire. News crews camped outside the Monterey County Courthouse, cameras rolling as reporters delivered breathless updates. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Clint Eastwood takes on the legal system and wins the first round. Go ahead, make my case. Hollywood icon stuns courtroom. Judge underestimated Eastwood. Now he regrets it. Social media exploded. They illicitly recorded clips from the courtroom circulated online, showing Eastwood calmly presenting evidence while his opposition floundered. Legal analysts debated the case on television. Look, no one expected Clint Eastwood to walk in and actually know the law, one analyst admitted, but the man has clearly done his homework. He's disciplined, precise, and, let's be honest, he commands that courtroom better than some actual lawyers. Outside, reporters swarmed as Eastwood stepped through the doors. Mr. Eastwood, did you expect to make such a strong impression? He adjusted his hat and gave a small shrug. I just came to tell the truth. Do you really think you can win this case without a lawyer? Another reporter called. Clint paused, turning fully toward the cameras. Justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is, he said. It's about what's right. Then, ignoring the sea of flashing lights, he walked to his car. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed. Reporters filled the gallery, eager to see if Eastwood's momentum would continue or if the defense would finally put him on the back foot. Gerald Parker was done playing nice. Straightening his tie, he approached the judge's bench. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter a motion, he said smoothly. Given the media frenzy, I move that Mr. Eastwood be required to retain legal counsel or withdraw his claim. Judge Bridger turned to Clint. Mr. Eastwood, do you have a response? Clint stood, hands resting lightly on the table. I do, he said, his voice steady. This is a public court. The public is watching. But the media didn't put Madsen's buildings on my land. The media didn't ignore my cease and desist letters. And the media sure as hell didn't file this lawsuit. He looked directly at Parker. I did. After a few more failed attempts at undermining the witness, Parker let out a sigh and conceded. No further questions. As the day's session came to a close, Judge Wallace Bridger found himself studying Clint Eastwood once again. From the very beginning, the courtroom had been stacked against him. No formal legal training, no prestigious law firm backing him. Yet, none of that had stopped him from seizing control of the case. Bridger had assumed this would be just another self-presented litigant stumbling through legal procedures, making mistakes until he ultimately lost. But Clint wasn't losing. He was winning, and as the gavel came down, Bridger realized something else. Hollywood might have taught Clint Eastwood how to deliver justice on screen, but out here in the real world, the legal system wasn't ready for him. By the time Clint Eastwood called Gerald Madsen to the stand, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. The air crackled with tension. The realization that Eastwood wasn't just holding his own, he was pressing forward, unshaken, unrelenting. Gerald Madsen, a wealthy real estate mogul in his mid-50s, walked up to the witness stand with the same cocky confidence that had earned him millions in the cutthroat world of high-end development. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he adjusted his tie, settling into the witness chair with an air of self-assurance. His attorney, Gerald Parker, approached first. "Mr. Madsen, let's clarify something for the court," Parker said smoothly. "Is it your belief that your company has acted within the law during its construction efforts?" Madsen nodded, his smirk unwavering. "Absolutely, we conducted a full legal review before breaking ground." Parker smiled. "So, in your expert opinion, is it possible that Mr. Eastwood is simply mistaken about the boundaries of his own property?" "I think that's a fair assumption," Madsen replied, his smirk deepening. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Clint sat at his table, hands folded, watching, waiting. "No further questions," Parker said, stepping back. A hush fell over the room as Clint slowly rose from his seat. He didn't grab his papers. He didn't even glance at his notes. With the same quiet confidence that had defined him for decades, he strode toward the witness stand. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Madsen," Clint said, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the developer, "you just testified that you believe I'm mistaken about my own land?" Madsen smirked again. "That's right." Clint gave a slight nod, then walked over to the evidence table, where aerial photos were neatly stacked. He picked up the first image, a shot of the land before construction began, and held it up for the courtroom to see. "Do you recognize this?" Madsen barely glanced at it. "Looks like an overhead shot of some property." Clint's eyes narrowed. "Not some property, my property, taken before your company started building." Madsen shrugged. "If you say so." Clint didn't react. Unfazed, he reached for another image. This one taken after construction had begun. It showed the luxury condos creeping past the legal boundary. "How about this one?" Clint asked, stepping closer. Madsen shifted slightly in his seat. "I've assumed that's from our development project." Clint nodded again, holding the two photos side by side. "And can you explain why part of your development is sitting on my land?" Madsen exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed. "Mr. Eastwood, property disputes happen all the time, lines get blurred. It's a complicated business." Clint took a step forward. "Blurred?" His voice remained calm, but there was steel behind it. He turned to the jury. "Boundaries don't get blurred by accident, they get ignored." He placed the photos down carefully and picked up a document. His official cease and desist letter, sent months before the lawsuit. "Did you receive this letter?" Madsen hesitated, then sighed. "I'm sure our legal team handled it." "That's not what I asked," Clint replied evenly. "Did you personally receive this letter?" Madsen shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, I suppose I did." Clint turned toward the jury again. "And after receiving this letter, after I made it clear that you were building on land that wasn't yours, did you stop construction?" Madsen's jaw tightened. Clint let the silence hang. Finally, Madsen cleared his throat. "No," he admitted. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Clint didn't react. He didn't press. He simply let the jury absorb the answer. After a long pause, he simply said, "No further questions." As Clint walked back to his seat, he caught the expressions of the jury members. At first they had been skeptical, some even amused. Yeah, they were leaning forward, their faces were serious. Judge Bridger rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. He had underestimated Eastwood. Madsen's lawyer had underestimated him. Everyone had. And now, piece by piece, Clint was dismantling the defense's case. At the defense table, Parker leaned in close to Madsen. "We need to rethink our strategy," he muttered. "If we don't shut him down soon, this case is going to spiral completely out of control." Madsen scowled, his confidence cracking. "Do whatever you have to." Across the courtroom, Clint sat back down, as calm as ever. He wasn't worried, he wasn't flustered, because he knew one thing. When the truth is on your side, you don't need to fight dirty, you just need to let the facts speak for themselves. By the time the court reconvened, the tension in the room had shifted. The smug confidence Gerald Parker had walked in with that morning, it was starting to fray at the edges. Gerald Madsen, the real estate mogul who had once dismissed Clint Eastwood as an aging actor playing pretend in a courtroom, now sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched. Clint, on the other hand, he was as composed as ever. While the defense strategized in hushed tones, he simply watched. Calm, patient, unshaken, Judge Bridger rubbed his temples before turning his attention to Parker. "Mr. Parker, you may proceed with your next witness." Parker stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and turned to the courtroom. He was trying to regain control. But Clint Eastwood wasn't done yet. Then he spoke. "You know," Clint said, his voice calm yet commanding, "I've been in a lot of movies over the years." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "But not a single one of them was about letting people get away with something they knew was wrong." He turned toward Madsen, locking eyes with the man who had tried to steal from him. Mr. Madsen knew exactly what he was doing. He thought I wouldn't fight back. He thought I'd take a payout like all the others. He thought he could take a piece of my land, turn it into luxury condos, and walk away richer for it. He let the words settle in the air, their weight pressing down on the room. "You're here today because justice isn't about money. It isn't about how expensive your lawyer is or how many suits you own." His gaze shifted to the jury, his sharp blue eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "It's about doing what's right." With that, he took a step back. "And that's all I have to say." As he walked back to his seat, the weight of his words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. Judge Bridger nodded solemnly. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow, when the jury will deliver its verdict." And just like that, the battle neared its end. The room remained silent. The following morning, the usual buzz that had filled the courtroom in previous days had been replaced by something else, a tense anticipation. Today, the trial would take its most decisive turn yet. Judge Wallace Bridger took his seat, adjusting his glasses with a seriousness he hadn't shown since the case began. "Mr. Eastwood, do you have any further witnesses before we move to closing arguments?" Clint Eastwood stood, steady as ever. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I'd like to call Mr. Daniel Ali to the stand." The name was unfamiliar to most in the courtroom, but at the defense table it sent a ripple of unease through Parker and Madsen. Gerald Parker frowned, throwing a glance at his client. Madsen, just as confused, muttered, "Who the hell is Ali?" Parker shook his head. No idea. Then, the back doors of the courtroom swung open. A man in his early 50s walked in, dressed in a work jacket and jeans, his boots scuffing against the polished floor. His face was tanned and lined, the mark of a man who had spent a lifetime working under the sun. The court clerk swore him in, and once he was settled, Clint approached, his pace slow, deliberate. "Mr. Ali," Clint began, his voice as steady as ever, "could you tell the court what you do for a living?" Ali cleared his throat. "I'm a construction foreman, been in the business over 20 years. And who have you worked for recently?" Ali shifted slightly, his eyes flicking toward Madsen before he exhaled. "Madison Development Corporation." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Parker sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness wasn't disclosed to the defense." Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow at Clint. "Mr. Eastwood?" Clint nodded. "Your Honor, Mr. Ali came forward last night of his own accord. He wasn't originally part of my witness list, but after hearing the testimony in this trial, he realized something." Clint turned toward Ali. "Tell the court what you realized, Mr. Ali." Ali swallowed hard, then looked straight at the judge. I realized I didn't want to be part of a cover-up. The courtroom erupted into gasps. Judge Bridger banged his gavel. Order! At the defense table, Parker's face had gone pale. Madsen had stiffened, sitting like a man who had just seen a ghost. Clint folded his arms. Mr. Ali, let's be clear. You're saying there was a cover-up? Ali nodded. Yes, sir. Clint walked over to the evidence table, picking up a thick folder. This is the original blueprint and construction plans submitted to the city for Madsen's development. Can you confirm this is the correct document? Ali took the folder, flipping through the pages carefully. After a moment, he nodded. Yes, these were the official plans. Clint leaned in slightly. And was there ever a second set of plans? Ali hesitated, his eyes darting toward Madsen. The real estate mogul's face was turning red with anger. Finally, Ali sighed. Yes, he admitted. There was a second set of plans. They weren't officially filed, but they included modifications, changes to push the property lines. More murmurs from the crowd. Parker jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this is highly irregular. There is no evidence of these so-called second plans. Judge Bridger turned to Ali. Do you have proof? Ali reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB flash drive. Yes, Your Honor. I made a backup of all the project files before construction began. These documents show two different versions of the same project, one legal and one not. Parker looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Madsen, meanwhile, was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Judge Bridger gestured to the bailiff, who took the flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. We'll have this examined immediately, Bridger said, before turning back to Ali. Mr. Ali, are you saying that Mr. Madsen was fully aware that his project was encroaching on Mr. Eastwood's land? Ali hesitated, but then nodded. Yes, he knew. We all knew. We were told to keep quiet about it. Clint turned to the jury, letting those words settle. Then he looked back at Ali. Why are you telling the truth now? Ali exhaled, looking down at his hands. Because I watched this trial. I saw you standing up there alone, just trying to get justice, and I realized that's the kind of man I should be. A beat of silence passed. Clint gave a small nod. No further questions. Judge Bridger turned to Parker. Mr. Parker, do you wish to cross-examine? Parker looked at Madsen, then back at the judge. He hesitated for a long moment before sighing. No, Your Honor. Judge Bridger nodded. Very well. This court will take a brief recess before moving forward. He banged his gavel, and the courtroom immediately erupted into conversation. Across the room, Clint sat back in his chair, calm as ever. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't gloating. He was just waiting, because he knew what was coming next, and for the first time since the trial began, the defense knew it too. They were going to lose. I don't have a fancy speech, Clint said simply. No theatrics, no legal tricks. He let his gaze sweep across the jury, each member holding their breath, waiting. What I do have is a piece of land. Land that I bought fair and square. Land I worked for. Land that was stolen from me, piece by piece, because someone thought they could get away with it. His voice was low and calm, yet each word cut through the silence like a blade. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was greed. He turned slightly, shifting his focus toward Madsen, whose face had darkened. Plain and simple. He took a slow step forward, closer to the jury. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the truth from someone who was inside Madsen's operation. And you've heard from his lawyer, who wants you to believe this is all just some big mix-up. Clint let the silence hang for a beat. But you already know better. Another pause. A heavy pause. Then he nodded. That's all I have to say. He returned to his seat. The room was still holding its breath. Judge Wallace Bridger looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you now have the case, he announced. Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict. The gavel struck. As the jury filed out, the air was thick with tension. Reporters rushed out the doors, eager to break the latest development to the world. At the defense table, Madsen's expression had shifted, his anger replaced with something else. Fear. We should have settled, he muttered to Parker. Parker exhaled, rubbing his temples. Yeah, we should have. Meanwhile, Clint sat in silence, his face unreadable. A younger man might have paced, might have fidgeted, might have let the weight of uncertainty get to him, but Clint Eastwood was patient. He had played this scene before, and he knew that soon enough the verdict would come. The truth was already out. Now it was just a matter of time. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and the tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. Clint Eastwood sat still, his hands folded in front of him, watching as the clock ticked away the minutes. His face remained impassive, but his mind was racing, going over every detail of the case, every document, every photo, every moment that had led them here. Across the room, Gerald Madsen was unraveling. His once polished exterior had begun to crack. He kept checking his watch, his eyes flicking nervously toward the jury room door, as if he could will them to come back with a favorable verdict. Parker, his attorney, sat beside him, furiously scribbling notes, his brow furrowed. He hadn't said much in the last hour, lost in the realization that the case was slipping away from them. Their defensive strategy had crumbled. Madsen's earlier arrogance seemed like a distant memory, replaced with a sinking feeling of inevitability. "Maybe they'll come back with a compromise," Madsen muttered, his voice tight. "A smaller settlement, at least." Parker didn't respond. He just kept scribbling, trying to salvage something, anything. But deep down, he knew it was over. Meanwhile, Clint remained calm. He hadn't looked at Madsen. He hadn't glanced at the jury room door. He simply waited, because he knew the truth was on his side. It wasn't a matter of if he would win, it was a matter of when. Then, the door to the jury room opened. A hush fell over the courtroom. The bailiff stepped inside, signaling for everyone to rise. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged woman with a calm, steady demeanor, entered the room holding a manila envelope. Her steps were measured, deliberate. Judge Bridger nodded toward her. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. The foreman walked up to the bench and handed the envelope to the judge. He took a moment to examine it, then turned back to the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Bridger said, his voice steady, "the jury has returned with a verdict. Please be seated." The courtroom sat in hushed anticipation, the air thick with uncertainty. Judge Bridger glanced at the envelope one last time, then began to read aloud. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Clint Eastwood." A wave of murmurs spread through the room. "We find that the defendant, Gerald Madsen, and Madsen Development Corporation, have knowingly encroached upon the plaintiff's property and have acted in bad faith by ignoring repeated requests to cease construction. The court awards the plaintiff full compensation for damages incurred, as well as additional punitive damages for the defendant's willful disregard of property law." A stunned silence followed. Clint didn't react immediately. He simply sat there, his face calm, letting the words sink in. Then the room erupted. Reporters scrambled, the air buzzing with shock, disbelief, and awe. At the defense table, Gerald Madsen was frozen, his face drained of color. He had lost. Completely. The trial he had dismissed as a nuisance, the case he thought he could control, had turned into his public humiliation. "Your Honor," Madsen's voice quivered, "we request an immediate stay of execution. This verdict is—" Judge Bridger raised a hand, cutting him off. "The jury's decision is final, Mr. Madsen. Any motions to delay or appeal will need to be filed through the proper channels." He turned to Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, would you like to make a statement before we conclude?" Clint stood slowly, his movements measured. He glanced around the courtroom. "I've spent a lot of time in courts," he said. "On screen, of course." A small ripple of laughter passed through the room. "But this time, I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't acting. I was standing up for what's right." He turned toward Madsen. "Mr. Madsen took my land. He thought he could get away with it. He thought he could ignore the law, silence the truth, and walk away with no consequences." Clint looked at the jury. "But today you made sure that justice prevailed." A brief silence, then a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Clint's voice remained steady. This wasn't just about property. This was about standing up for what's right, even when it's not easy. He turned to the judge. "No further comments, Your Honor." Judge Bridger nodded, his expression softening. "The court acknowledges the verdict. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay the awarded damages in full, as well as the plaintiff's legal fees." Court is adjourned. The gavel's struck, and Clint Eastwood had won.